In 1974, a nun disappeared from every church record in West Virginia, as if she had never existed. Tonight, we uncover the mystery of Sister Agnes, the nun erased from history. Before we begin, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And brace yourself, because the Valley remembers everything. Every ledger entry, every photograph, every note that mentioned her name, erased. As if she had never walked those stone hallways. Her name was Sister Agnes, though few today remember it. Fewer still speak it aloud. Some claim that, even decades later, she moves among the halls of the abandoned convent, a quiet presence the mountains themselves seem to keep. Locals whisper that you shouldn't go near the Ridge Valley Convent after dusk, that no footsteps should echo there without consequence, that even when the lights are off, someone is watching. But there are no official warnings, no news stories at the time, no explanation of what happened to her. Only the gaps in the church's own records, wide and empty, stretching across years, and a memory kept only in whispers. Imagine walking those mountains, fog clinging to your clothes, the air thick with mist and the scent of wet pine. You step on leaves, crisp, dry, and suddenly they crunch under something else. Footsteps behind you, perhaps, but when you turn, there is no one there. Only the echo of wind through the valleys, and the faint toll of a bell, long since silenced, calling across the ridge. Sister Agnes was ordinary in every sense, devoted, quiet. A woman who kept meticulous notes in her ledger, who performed her duties without complaint, and whose faith never faltered. Yet, in one moment, the evidence of her existence was stripped away. The mountains held her, the valley remembered, but the church, which had once chronicled every sister in its care, acted as though she had been a shadow all along. And for decades, those who spoke of her disappearance were dismissed, ignored, or in some cases, shunned. Only the faint stories remain, told late at night over flickering lights. Stories of a nun who moved quietly, who walked through the fog, and who, perhaps, continues to walk, unseen but never forgotten. The question is not simply what happened to her. The question is why. And why, after all these years, there are still those who claim to feel her presence, watching, listening, marking time in a place that officially does not exist. Tonight, we follow the trail of Sister Agnes, through the mountains, through the archives, through the whispers of a community that remembers more than it admits. We will examine the files, the letters, the vanished photographs, and the testimonies that survived. We will walk the halls where no one dares tread alone, and we will ask the question everyone fears. What happens when a life is deliberately erased, and yet refuses to vanish completely? The mountains of West Virginia in 1974 were quiet, too quiet. Ridge Valley lay draped in fog that rolled down the slopes like a slow, wet blanket, settling over the stone walls of the convent and the narrow dirt roads that led to it. The air smelled of wet pine, decaying leaves, and smoke from chimneys burning low as autumn approached winter. Every breath you drew felt heavier, as though the fog itself weighed on your chest. The convent was a tall, austere building of grey stone, its windows narrow and dark, reflecting the late afternoon light like black mirrors. The wooden doors groaned in the wind, a low moan that travelled across the empty courtyard. And somewhere inside, a candle flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. You could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot before seeing them. A branch snapped in the distance. A shutter rattled. The sound of a bell, long unused, echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the hills. It was as if the valley itself breathed in rhythm with the convent, holding secrets, absorbing each sound, each small disturbance, and never letting them leave. Inside the building, the air was colder. Drafts slipped under the doors, carrying the scent of old parchment, wax, and mildew. Hallways stretched into darkness, lined with the faded photographs of sisters whose faces stared silently from frames. Their eyes seemed to follow you, not in malice, but in quiet observation, as if noting who walked through the halls. The floorboards creaked underfoot, though sometimes you could swear no one had walked there at all. A ledger lay open on a desk, pages yellowed and brittle, ink faded. On one page, a name had been scratched out so thoroughly, it left only a rough shadow where it once existed. Outside, the fog thickened. The mountains were veiled, outlines of trees reduced to black silhouettes that swayed in the wind. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional howl of a distant dog or the scrape of branches brushing against stone. Every sound seemed amplified, carrying farther than it should. A wind gust rattled the windows, a shutter slammed somewhere upstairs, and for a moment you felt certain someone, or something, had passed by just beyond your sight. Sister Agnes moved through this world quietly, meticulously, never drawing attention. Yet even in her presence, the building seemed aware of her. Candles flickered more brightly when she passed. Ledgers shifted as though touched by invisible hands, and the faint scent of lilies followed her, lingering in spaces no one else occupied. She moved through rooms that smelled of wax and old wood, her footsteps deliberate but soft, and every so often a whispered word escaped her lips. A prayer, a thought, or perhaps a warning. Even today, decades later, those who enter the ruins of Ridge Valley Convent speak of the same sensations. The chill that doesn't leave, the faint smell of lilies when no flowers exist, the quiet sensation of being watched. And for those who have studied the records, or what remains of them, it becomes clear that Sister Agnes's presence was always more than human, more than just the living sister she appeared to be. It was something recorded in the building itself, in the fog, in the silence of the mountains. Tonight, we step into this world, not just the halls of the convent, not just the rooms filled with empty desks and yellowed ledgers, but into the very air that has held her memory for decades. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light may be nothing, or it may be the remnants of a life deliberately erased, refusing to vanish. As the days passed in Ridge Valley, the convent seemed almost alive. Candles flickered for no reason. Doors that had been firmly closed creaked open in empty corridors. Footsteps echoed across hallways long after the last sister had passed by. And always, the faintest whisper of something moving just out of sight. A shadow where none should be. Sister Agnes kept to her routine. She attended prayers at dawn, tended to the gardens, and meticulously recorded everything in her ledger. But even her meticulousness could not stop the disturbances. A chair would be found overturned, a window slightly ajar, or a ledger page missing entirely, only to reappear days later with names scratched out. She tried to ignore it. She told herself it was the wind, the old building settling, the imagination of tired eyes. Yet small, inexplicable incidents began to accumulate. One evening, a candle she had lit in the library flickered violently, though there was no draught. She turned to steady it, and in the reflection of the window, she saw a figure, a sister perhaps, standing in the shadows. But when she blinked, no one was there. The air grew colder, heavier, as if carrying the memory of something unseen. The other sisters noticed too. Letters she had written to the diocese vanished without a trace. Pages she had meticulously written were found in the corridors, their contents illegible, as if blurred by some unseen hand. And sometimes, when the convent was otherwise empty, a soft whisper drifted through the halls, a voice she could not recognize, repeating words she had never spoken aloud. Outside, the mountains pressed in, fog thickening in the valleys and rolling down to meet the convent's walls. Animals went silent at dusk, as if aware of the tension in the air. One night, the caretaker swore he saw a figure moving along the roof, robes trailing behind, though the building was locked tight and no one could have gained access. Sister Agnes herself began to feel watched, though the halls were empty. At times, she caught glimpses in mirrors, reflections that did not match her movements. The faint smell of lilies would arise, though no flowers were anywhere nearby, and ledger pages once written would show the faintest alterations by morning, as though someone or something had rewritten history while she slept. Rumors began to circulate among the locals. People spoke in hushed tones about the nun who moved silently through the fog, whose name had been removed from the records, yet whose presence lingered in the valley. They said the mountains remembered her, that even the stones and the trees held her memory. One villager claimed he had followed a figure along the trail past the convent, only to find the path empty when he reached the clearing. And when he returned, a ledger page had appeared in his mailbox, with a name carefully scratched out. The tension mounted slowly, relentlessly. Every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light became a question. Was it the building? Was it memory? Or was it something that had refused to be erased? Something that had witnessed what no one else could? Every day, the convent became a place where ordinary events carried a weight beyond explanation. Every night, Sister Agnes wondered if the building itself was marking her existence or her absence. By the end of that week, the disturbances escalated further. Objects she had placed in the sacristy were found in the courtyard. Pages she had carefully logged were shredded in patterns she did not understand. Shadows seemed to move independently of the light. And always, there was the faint impression of eyes following her in the corners of every room. It was impossible to ignore. The convent had become a living record of her presence and absence simultaneously. Every routine she attempted only drew attention to her, though from whom or what she could not say. And then came the ledger that would not lie. One morning, Sister Agnes opened the main ledger to find her own name missing, carefully erased, as though it had never existed at all. She stared at the empty space, ink faded to nothing. Her own history gone. And for the first time, she realized the valley, the convent, the mountains, even the fog, had begun to act independently of her understanding. Someone, or something, had decided she would no longer be a part of history. It happened one evening as the fog rolled down the valley, thick and almost suffocating. Sister Agnes had stayed late in the convent, the last candle flickering beside her ledger. The halls were silent, or so she believed. Then she heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like a chair being dragged across stone. She froze. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The sound moved closer, not in a straight line, but circling, unpredictable, deliberate. She rose slowly, her footsteps light against the creaking floorboards. In the corner of the hallway, she glimpsed movement. A shadow, darker than the night around it, shifting independently of the candlelight. It wasn't a figure she recognized. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It seemed to watch her, to measure her, waiting for her to break the silence. In the chapel, the candles she had lit earlier flared and then died simultaneously, plunging the room into near darkness. Only a faint glow from the fog outside the windows illuminated the pews, casting long, twisting shapes across the floor. And then she saw it. A figure in a nun's habit, hovering just above the floor at the far end of the hall. Its face was hidden, obscured by shadow, but she swore the robes moved as if breathing. And the ledger on the table, the one she had been guarding, the one that had contained her own name, fluttered open, pages flipping violently, stopping on a single line, her name completely erased. She stepped closer, drawn by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The figure mirrored her movements, always just out of reach, always silent. She reached for the ledger, and the room seemed to tilt, the shadows stretching and bending toward her. A cold wind rushed through the windows, carrying the faint scent of lilies, though there were none to be seen. She blinked. The figure was gone. The ledger lay closed, her name absent, as if nothing had happened. But the air remained heavy, charged, almost alive. And then she noticed them. The shadows along the walls were no longer still. They moved, inching, curling, shifting in ways the human eye should not be able to follow. They weren't trying to harm her. Not yet. They were simply there, observing, marking her presence, measuring her absence. In that moment, Sister Agnes understood something she had never known before. The convent itself, the mountains, the fog. They were not merely witnesses. They were record keepers. Her life, her work, her very existence could be erased from paper, from ink, from memory. But it could never be erased from the valley, from the air, from the silence that listened. She fled the hall, down the corridors she had known every brick of, yet every turn seemed unfamiliar. Doors she had opened 100 times, refused to budge. Steps echoed where no one had walked, and in the reflection of the chapel windows, she saw it again. The figure, always distant, always just out of reach, its face still hidden, robes moving like smoke in the wind. And then, as abruptly as it began, the room stilled. The candlelight returned, soft and ordinary. The shadows settled back into place. The ledger lay open, pages still blank where her name should have been. For decades afterward, those who walked the halls alone swore they felt the presence of someone, or something, watching, not angry, not vengeful, simply aware. A reminder that some lives, even when erased from history, refuse to vanish entirely. The story of Sister Agnes did not end with the ledger or the shadows, or even that night when the figure appeared in the hall. It continued quietly, invisibly, in ways that few outside Ridge Valley would ever notice. Letters she had sent to the diocese vanished from the archives. Correspondence that mentioned her by name had been removed, shredded, or faded to illegibility. And yet, fragments remained. Slips of paper tucked into books, corners of photographs, where her presence was just barely visible. Every piece suggested a life meticulously documented and meticulously erased. The locals remembered differently. One elder recalled Sister Agnes walking the foggy paths at dawn, her habit damp with mist, a faint glimmer of candlelight reflecting in her eyes. Another claimed that the sound of her footsteps followed the valley paths long after she had left, echoing through empty forests and across abandoned fields. A few dared to approach the convent in the decades after. They reported that ledger pages seemed to move on their own. Doors opened to reveal rooms that should have been empty. Shadows shifted where there should have been only darkness. And always there was the faint, unmistakable scent of lilies in corners of the building no one had entered. Researchers who attempted to reconstruct her life faced dead ends. Parish records listed her for years, and then nothing. Newspaper clippings vanished. Photographs were misplaced or destroyed. Even testimonies of other sisters became contradictory, as if memory itself had been influenced by the fog, by the convent, by some unseen force protecting the secret of her existence. Stories circulated, hushed and fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror. That Sister Agnes had walked the valley, unseen yet observed. That she had spoken to no one for days, yet knowledge of her movements persisted. That sometimes letters would appear, unsigned, describing things that only she could have known. Her own life reflected back to her in ink that seemed alive. And still, the convent stood, its stone walls unchanging, its corridors silent. But inside, history was fluid. Names could disappear, records could vanish, shadows could linger long after their owners had gone. One account tells of a young seminarian who entered the convent decades later. He claimed to see a figure at the far end of the hall, a nun in shadow, watching him. When he approached, the figure vanished. Yet when he opened the ledger on the nearby desk, he found a single page had been added in handwriting that was unmistakably Sister Agnes's. A note, brief, simple, warning him to remember what is unseen. Even outside the convent, the valley seemed to hold her. Dogs would bark at nothing. Leaves rustled in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Mist would roll down the mountains in shapes that resembled a figure moving, robe trailing, walking toward the horizon. Hikers and locals alike reported a presence they could not explain. A feeling of being watched, of being measured, of history itself pressing on them. The mystery deepened when archivists discovered that some records had been removed with extreme precision. It was as if someone, or something, had understood what would be seen, and erased only that which could prove her existence. No mistakes, no errors. Just an absence that was impossible to ignore once noticed. And yet, despite the erasure, fragments persisted. A photo tucked behind a frame showing her silhouette. A ledger page faded but legible, a signature half erased. Testimonies from villagers who claimed to have glimpsed her, walking along the ridge in fog. Every fragment hinted at a life that had been lived fully, and yet denied by every official channel. By the end of this period, it was clear. The convent, the valley, and even the fog itself were not merely witnesses to Sister Agnes. They were guardians of a secret, preserving her presence in a way that records could not. And anyone who dared to look closely, to follow the trail of erased documents, whispered stories, and flickering shadows, could feel it. That some part of her had refused to vanish, that the valley itself remembered her existence long after history had tried to forget. Decades have passed since Sister Agnes walked the halls of Ridge Valley Convent. The stone walls still stand. The fog still rolls down the mountains. But what remains is not merely the building. It is the memory, or perhaps the presence, of a life that refuses to vanish. Visitors to the valley report the same things they did in 1974. Shadows that move without source. Steps that echo where no one has walked. Candles that flare and die in moments of silence. And always the faint scent of lilies that lingers long after the flowers have gone. Historians who study the archives confront the same puzzle. Sister Agnes's name appears in records one moment, and the next, it is gone. Letters and photographs vanish or are found altered in ways no one can explain. Evidence exists that she lived, that she worked, that she walked among the sisters, and yet the official history remains blank. Some claim the convent itself protects her story, that the mountains, the fog, the very air remembers what ink has erased, that her presence is woven into the valley in ways that defy logic, defy records, defy understanding. Others whisper that she is still here, watching, waiting, ensuring that even if history forgets her, no one can truly erase the impression of her existence. That those who enter the halls alone may feel her eyes, hear her steps, or glimpse her shadow just beyond the corner of their vision. And perhaps that is the cruelest part. A life can be erased from the page. A name can be removed from ledgers. But the valley, the convent, the fog, they remember. They remember in ways that those who seek answers cannot deny. It is a reminder that some mysteries cannot be solved, some presences cannot be captured, and some lives, even when deliberately erased from history, leave traces that haunt the spaces they once occupied. For those who wander Ridge Valley today, the feeling is unmistakable, a sense that someone or something is present, not threatening perhaps, not angry, simply aware, watching, measuring the living against the past, the erased, and the unseen. So we leave you with this. Sister Agnes may have been removed from every church record, erased from every official account, and denied by history itself. But in the valleys, in the fog, in the silent corridors of the convent, she endures. And the question that lingers is this: if a life can be erased from history, what does it mean when memory itself refuses to let go? Would you spend a night alone in Ridge Valley? Would you walk the foggy paths, knowing that someone might be watching, not to harm, but simply to observe? These are the questions the valley leaves with you, and they are the questions that remain long after the candles have burned out, long after the shadows have settled, and long after the story has ended, at least on paper. If you are still watching, you are braver than most. Subscribe to Dark Room of Whispers for more stories that dwell in the corners of history and memory, where some lives refuse to vanish.